Welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we've been reading outside of book club, the ones we get to pick and choose.
And so, coming up, The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis, The Female Persuasion by Meg Wollitzer, Why Mummy Drinks by Gill Sims, Poverty Safari by Darren McGarvey, Hawkfall and Other Stories by George Mackay Brown, My Thoughts Exactly by Lily Allen, and Bonjour Tristesse by Françoise Sagan.
Keep listening to find out what we thought of them and whether there might be any gems in here for your next book club pick.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review.
I'm quite keen to hear about The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis.
Because I was going to say, I want to hear about the things that you've been reading. Okay, well, we'll start with mine.
Well, you know, we both love Michael. So
That's true.
Let's start there.
That's true. Anyone who listened to our last bookshelf will know how we feel about Michael Lewis. The Fifth Risk is his latest book, and in it he examines three government departments, the Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, and Department of Commerce, and looks at how they're faring under the Trump administration. The answer to that is fairly badly, because the Trump administration have been sending in people to manage these organisations that are underqualified and underprepared and, frankly, uninterested in the jobs that they've been put there to do, or so it seems. But really it's a book about why that matters and what's at stake, and the risks in question are risks that maybe people aren't aware the degree to which they're managed by these large, fairly anonymous government departments. So Department of Energy, for example, is responsible for the nuclear side of things. And then there are other things like the electrical grid, which obviously, if there are problems with that, that would be hugely disruptive, could be a big threat. The Weather Service, which is managed by... It's the Department of Agriculture who does the weather. But again, it's a huge part of that department's budget. And it might not seem like it's very important, but actually it is one of the main things in the States that keeps people safe, being able to warn people about the weather.
And so do other weather organizations, like the Weather Network, for example, do they get their data from a government organization?
Yes, they do. The guy that was brought in by Trump to manage the Weather Service is the CEO of a company called AccuWeather.
Right. He doesn't have any conflict of interest.
No. But so it's sort of unpicking things like that. It's typical Michael Lewis. It's full of ideas, and he pulls out really interesting people. These are dedicated public servants who are doing wonderful, amazing things, or were, but who subsequently have been let go. And the work that they were doing is just sort of foundering. And he sort of goes into what that is and why it matters. There's an area in eastern Washington called Hanford. And since the sort of 50s, this has been the place where America manufactured plutonium to use in weapons. Finished in 1987, I think, was when they shut it down. And there's this huge cleanup operation now to make this area safe, because there's billions of tons of radioactive waste that's been buried in poorly lined pits. This is sort of a huge existential threat of contamination and Fukushima-style plumes of things evaporating. The Columbus River is near there. So there's now an issue with this massive, what he describes as a glacier of radioactive sludge, which is slowly seeping towards this river. And these departments, which seem like, Department of Energy, what do? That's what they do. Project management of that cleanup and the funding that supports that is what they do. And if you take that away, and the scariest thing I think about this book is the idea that the Trump people have gone in and deliberately taken a position of ignorance. Because there's a kind of safety in that and security in that. If you don't have any knowledge, then you don't have to take any responsibility. And that seems to be the active policy insofar as he is able to work out. And so it's a very timely book. It's quite short and sweet. Well, not sweet, really. It's quite short and scary. But, classic Michael Lewis fashion. It's very easy to read, really vivid, often quite funny and fascinating, just fascinating stories. It almost felt it wasn't as complete a package as his books usually are. The reason for that is because it's an ongoing story. We don't know what the conclusion is. We can only hope that it will be a good one. It leaves lots of loops open. And so in a way, it almost feels a little bit unsatisfying, but I still think it's an absolutely worthwhile read, and I would recommend it. And for all I was alarmed by it, I did enjoy it. It was good.
It makes me think about the infrastructural nightmares that await us if Brexit pans out. If we crash out, all of these questions around infrastructure that we just take for granted, we don't even think about it, will suddenly break down, grind to a halt.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's, I suppose, more for Americans than for us, but, you know, partly it's about trying to educate people as to what these government departments do. And interestingly, the Obamas, I saw, have optioned it on Netflix to develop possibly into some kind of series of programs.
Those Obamas.
I know.
Would you recommend it?
But I like that. I think that they and Michael Lewis are a good fit. I would recommend it. Yeah, it was good. How about you?
I have done some great reading recently. I'm going to start with my favourite book, which is Poverty Safari, Understanding the Anger of Britain's Underclass by Darren McGarvey. And it is the winner of the Orwell Prize in 2018. And a Sunday Times bestseller, the cover informs me. Someone in book club recommended this as a potential read, and then I saw it in a bookshop, and it's got this great cover, this housing estate outside of Glasgow, I imagine.
Sort of monumental, almost looks like Stonehenge.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And the author, Darren McGarvey, he grew up on one of these estates in a really rough part of Glasgow, and he had a very dysfunctional upbringing. But this is not a misery memoir. He says very knowingly about halfway through, all anyone has ever really wanted to hear about is his dead mother. And that's perversely become the platform for him having a voice about his experiences and what he feels his community needs. But he's much, much more interested in talking about his ideas, speaking particularly to the left, because he himself is on the left, but about how you can help empower these communities, first by listening to them and not coming in with well-intentioned middle-class ideals. He's an incredible writer. He's entirely self-taught. I say self-taught, not like Tara Westover self-taught. He did go to school, but he didn't go to university. He was an addict. He was an alcoholic. And it was only in his probably late 20s that he's managed to overcome these addictions. But that said, all along, he has been a rapper, rapping about his experience.
All right.
And he's never been a reader. He talks about being terrified of books, that they're so beyond his upbringing and childhood that he could never get more than a few pages in. They're just too intimidating. But because he was a rapper, he was kind of obsessed with language and how it fits together. And his activism, which stemmed from him being a rapper, stemmed from that story. He was very involved in the independence movement in Scotland. And he was called upon as kind of the voice of his community. But he found that actually people didn't really want to engage with him beyond a certain point. He was only allowed to have opinions that matched what these middle-class leftists thought was right. And this book then becomes a way, I think, of pushing back against those voices. And it's super exciting. You know, when you start to think about, from our London bubble, nice, affluent, middle-class left people, and we think, oh, well, what could we possibly do for people who've come from entrenched poverty and violence? I think Darren McGarvey would say, well, the first thing is to actually listen, not to come in with good intentions, but to actually listen to what the community wants. And that's where this really provocative title, Poverty Safari, comes from.
It sounds good. It sounds a bit worthy.
It's not.
Is it going to be... But then you could say that about Michael Lewis, so...
No, it's not worthy at all, actually, because he's a brilliant writer. He's got a fierce intelligence to him, but he's also quite funny at moments. He's this really bleak humour. He says, all everyone ever wanted to hear about was my dead mum, and then they just wanted me to shut up. I'd highly recommend it. And you can see, I got about halfway through and I started turning down lots and lots of little pages. It's a really... It's also a really, really easy read. And he's very articulate, and he's unlike anyone I've ever read before.
Good for book club?
Fantastic for book club.
Sounds good. You sold it to me.
Good. That was my intention. I've been recommending it to everyone. I also am reading, sort of, a very different memoir, Lily Allen's My Thoughts Exactly. I've paused, actually.
Is it too full on?
No, it's really not great.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but I had it recommended to me by a friend who said it was an easy read, a quick page turner. And she was surprised by how open Lily Allen was about her past. And maybe she almost shared too much. My problem is I'm comparing it to Dolly Alderton's Everything I Know About Love. The difference is that Dolly Alderton isn't famous. She's a journalist. And Lily Allen is obviously a very well-known pop star. Dolly Alderton's memoir is fantastic. Lily Allen's not so much. Now, that's a bit unfair because Lily Allen was a pop star, not a writer. But it just feels really surface level, like things happen and she introduces people, but there's no character development. She'll introduce someone and then it will say, the well-known producer who was responsible for blah, 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 blah. And you're like, that's the editor. You can imagine Lily Allen just writing stream of consciousness about all these things that happened to her. And then the editor having to go back through and being like, right, well, you haven't mentioned who this person is or given any context. So I found it quite clunky. I know other people have enjoyed it. I don't know if I'm going to keep going.
It's beautifully designed.
Well, yes.
Sorry, listeners, you can't see it.
It looks great. And I hadn't quite appreciated how, in a very different way to Darren McGarvey, how dysfunctional her upbringing had been and how her father had been, just utterly disconnected from his children's lives. Even when she became famous, he never would see her perform. He's just not bothered whatsoever.
Do you think we're the wrong demographic?
I don't think so. I'm similar age to her. I remember when her first hit came out because I think I was recently arrived in London. So for me, it is wrapped up in those same years.
So it sounds like she's got an interesting story to tell, but maybe she's just not enough of a writer to really make it sing. It's completely unrelated, but I read The Female Persuasion by Meg Wollitzer, which is a story about feminism. It's a novel. It's about a young girl, Greer Kadetsky, her name is, she's a college student, and she meets this older woman who's a sort of leading feminist, you know, so one of these iconic people who she's very influenced by. She's sort of very struck by this person and her ideals and her activism, and she wants to follow in her footsteps, I suppose, and also makes her reevaluate things that are going on in her own life. It's a tricky one, this, because it was a really good novel. Meg Wollitzer is a really good writer. I've read a couple of other things of hers that I remember really enjoying, although I don't remember much about them now. But, you know, you're in a really safe pair of hands. The characters are well developed. The dialogue is believable. It's got that nice range of emotions where something could be very fraught and yet at the same time maybe a little bit funny, and you know, she does all that really. It's sort of expertly written, and I think the problem for me was it just fell slightly flat on the idea of the feminist story and the idea of this woman who I never really believed in, this Faith Frank character. She didn't really mean anything to me, and I felt like she was presented as someone who said great, incredibly motivational things, but they always just sounded like really sort of empty platitudes to me, and so I never really bought that this kind of sparky younger woman would have been so enthralled by her. But then it was funny, I had this little mini book club with my mother-in-law where we decided we would both read the same thing and share our thoughts on it, and it was really interesting because her reaction was totally different to mine. She loved the whole sort of setup and didn't question this character, and in fact I think found her someone she felt familiar and that she could relate to and seemed quite believable to her. And I was like, really? She's like, yeah. So it was good, but it was very funny. She's a bit older than me, and she said obviously my mother-in-law, she's a generation older than me, and she said she felt it was perhaps a generational thing. And for her, what it was almost an overview of the history of the feminist movement and the women who've been leading lights in that movement and the women who've followed them and how the ideas have been disseminated. And in a way, it's a kind of about the limitations of that and how it's not easy, and maybe the glass ceiling is starting to crack, but it's still there, and then into fighting between women themselves. She sort of touches on these things, but for me it wasn't really in a way that made me feel anything, apart from a mild enjoyment in the story, which was really good, and okay. You know, kind of page turn, right? You cared about these characters, and funny enough, the boyfriend's arc was the one I liked the best, and his family story.
Where's it set?
It's in America, like California, I think. Okay. It feels like a hard book to really criticize because I think it is so well written, and the spirit of it I think was good. She was inspired by Nora Ephron, who I think by all accounts was just this sort of totally wonderful person, screenwriter, who I think, you know, she influenced and helped Meg Wollitzer, and that's sort of what she was exploring in this book, but it just didn't work. So a great novel, I think, actually, really good novel, but it didn't reach further than that for me.
Would it be a good book club book?
Well, I would have said no, but then we had a really good discussion about it that made me think perhaps yes. I don't know.
I'm going to say up front that I think this book would not be a good book club book. It is called Hawkfall and Other Stories, and it's by George Mackay Brown.
You don't need to be in a book club. You read kind of very, like, why would you read that?
Well, this is the opposite of Lily Allen. This is a terrible cover.
This thing about, you know, book clubs making you read things you wouldn't normally read, but I feel like you just do that anyway.
No.
I should describe it for listeners, but it's got a sort of, what is it, some kind of island coastline, looks like British Isles.
Orkney.
Okay, there you go. And there's a sort of stake with a ram's skull.
Do you think that's a ram, or I wondered if that was something from a whale?
No, that's a ram.
Okay.
A whale? Those are ram's horns.
Okay. Really?
You know whales don't have horns, right?
I thought it could be some sort of like...
But is the book about whales?
No.
Well, then, no, it's not a whale.
No. I went to Orkney last summer, and my mother's side of the family is from Orkney.
Okay, now it's all starting
and
to
I didn't pick this up at the time, although I did see it in some bookshops there. But actually, a friend of mine who had been to Orkney a few years ago, Andy, I say Andy because Kate knows Andy.
In my book club.
And this is exactly the kind of thing that Andy would like. He likes his regional, slightly obscure fiction. But Andy is also a great judge of prose, and Hawkfall is incredibly beautiful. It's one of those books you read and you think, oh, what a shame that the design isn't really there, that it doesn't lure people in. In fact, it probably repels them because the writing is absolutely beautiful. And I'm not one for short stories, but each of these felt just perfect. And they span, probably like 1,200 years. Sometimes they're set back when the Vikings were in Orkney. Sometimes they're set just after World War One. Other times you're not entirely sure because it's such a timeless place and life didn't change there very quickly. It's quite possible that I respond to it so much just because of that family connection. But it is really beautiful and it feels very wise in its simple stories about moments in individuals' lives and the connections of a community and how people in a small island support and also slightly despise each other sometimes. You know, that real nexus of personalities that you never have in a city like London because it's so big and diffuse. There's so many people here. You can never become quite so intimate with people who you don't like. So wonderful to read, Hawkfall, and George Mackay Brown, brilliant writer, but I don't think it would be a good book club book.
Or just not enough to...
I think it's too simple. I think it has a wisdom to the writing that you couldn't contest, even if you didn't like it, but it wouldn't necessarily lead to much discussion, other than kind of remarking on the events of the story, because it's so subtly done. So highly recommend it, but maybe just as a palate cleanser.
If you can't actually go to Orkney, would this book make you feel like you were... Because I've never been, I'd love to go, but it's not likely that I'll be going anytime soon. If I read that book, will that satisfy my lust to go to the small Scottish islands?
It might. It might. It's very difficult to know sometimes when you're reading a book about a specific region, if it would move you if you hadn't been there. And also, what would you imagine, right? I imagine if you read this, you'd probably think of like the Scottish Highlands and the coast around Scottish mainland. But having been there now, and also being quite moved by the fact, you know, that I went to the old family homestead and so forth, it really resonated with me. I was going to buy a copy for my brother because of the family connection.
Well, if he's listening, forget that you heard that, and there might be a nice surprise coming your way soon. It couldn't be further away from the purity of the remote Scottish island. I read a book called Why Mummy Drinks by Gill Sims. I went for a weekend away with some dear school friends, old school friends of mine, who've all got children of similar ages, and one of them recommended it. I idly downloaded it on the Kindle, and I started reading, and I started laughing, and I polished it off. It's one of those ones where I kind of think you do need to be a parent of small children, or you maybe want to be reminded of what it was like when your children were small to really appreciate it. So I'm not sure it would appeal to everybody, and I don't think for that reason it would make a particularly good book club unless your book club are fellow parents. If you've got a mum's book club that you're doing with school or something like that, you met in the playground and you've started a book club, actually I would suggest this book might be a really good one for you. It's just, she's very, very good at observing the little details of why it all can be such a nightmare sometimes. At the same time, it's slightly problematic because it's a very particular experience that I can obviously really relate to. It's like you were saying earlier, you know, lovely middle class.
Does she live in Islington?
Probably. I mean, I feel like she's probably a West Londoner, but, you know, it's a very particular niche, and you're always complicit in that when you're reading it. But at the same time, it's just written with a lot of heart, and it's very funny.
And why not, really? Because up until maybe 5-10 years ago, remember, women weren't even allowed to kind of voice any complaints about how life is difficult when you have children.
Yes, that's true. In some ways, it almost felt a bit like revelations like, oh, even the posh mummies who always seem to have frozen mango or granola to give their children, even they're having a terrible time too. Strangely, that didn't feel so revelatory to me now. I mean, maybe if I'd read it just when my children were very, very small and I hadn't met other parents yet, but now it feels like, yeah, and, you know, no one thinks that, do they? You know. But I think it was very good on that sense of this kind of constant struggle to keep up with what you think you should be doing. And well, she does brilliantly, very nice setup where she does her ideal day, and, you know, you get up at 6:45, do 20 minutes yoga, then get the children up and they will come down to breakfast and we will sit there and we will debate the issues of the day while we eat our granola, and then we will get ready to go to school and all the school things would have been laid out the night before, and we will smilingly go off and, you know, of course, you see where, and then the next page is the actual reality, and the actual reality is so ridiculous and so funny and such a million miles away from her ideals, and I think it's that made it very, very good. But I was thinking, what is it like? It's a little bit like almost Bridget Jones's Diary, but that was very funny. And the characters were spot on. It also did have a story. She went somewhere. She sort of changed, and she was a slightly different person at the end of that book to the way she was at the beginning. And this doesn't really do that. There's not really a kind of overarching narrative or a lot of character development. It just is what it is. But what it was very enjoyable, very fun, and made me laugh a lot. So for any other stressed out parents out there, I recommend that one.
I'm enjoying how far-ranging and slightly bizarre our reading list is this episode.
It's quite an eclectic one. I'm going from fears of nuclear Armageddon in America to why mummies in the playground need to drink.
To the Orkneys, to Glasgow, to Liliane Popstar.
To French literature.
Well, exactly. So I read Bonjour Tristesse by Françoise again. I picked up a beautiful little penguin copy from the local Oxfam. Have you read Bonjour Tristesse?
I think I've maybe tried to read it in French and gave up.
It's very short.
I know.
I read it in about 2.5 hours, I reckon. It is the story of 17-year-old Cécile and her father, and she spent her childhood in a convent school because her mother is dead. And then when she's 15 and is ready to leave school, he says, oh, you know, come live with me. And they have this very happy but quite bohemian life together where they just travel around. Her father's independently rich, and he has a series of mistresses who just kind of move in and out of their lives. But it's all quite amicable and civilized and very, very French.
Was he married, did you say?
His wife died.
Okay, so they're not really mistresses.
Well, I suppose not. Yes, I suppose
it's very pedantic
so.
Of me. But...
That is very pedantic of you.
Sorry.
I think what I should say is the book was published in 1954. So this isn't a contemporary tale. So I don't know the status of unmarried women who slept with men in the 1950s, but it's very much in the tradition of that demi-monde demi-mondaine. You know, these women who were professional mistresses, kept women, right?
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so it wasn't like he had girlfriends.
Yeah, okay.
They were kept women who would be charming and lovely and hostesses and sweep through the upper classes or the independently wealthy for a short time, but never planned on kind of marrying the men they were with, and similarly the men never planned on marrying them. So this is quite an unusual lifestyle for a young 17-year-old who's supposed to be quite innocent. But Cécile is very happy, and the novel starts when her and her father and his latest mistress, Elsa, are headed to the Côte d'Azur. But then Cécile finds out that Anne, her mother's old friend, is going to come and stay with them. Anne comes from the real world almost. She's normal. She's not like them. She thinks that their world is frivolous, a bit silly. She disapproves it a little bit, not with any harsh judgment, but obviously she doesn't think this is a good situation for a 17-year-old girl. The immediate, I say twist, but it's not really a twist, the immediate event is that Anne is actually in love with Cécile's father and manages to displace the current mistress. And suddenly Cécile's freedoms are curbed. She's no longer allowed to go out swimming and walking in the forest with the student nearby. And so Cécile decides that Anne needs to go. Dot.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
Well, no. I mean, it's not a murder story by any means, maybe. Well, anyway, so it was a bestseller in the 1950s and quite infamous and scandalous for this, I was going to say debauched 17-year-old, but she's really not. And maybe it's just that we've moved on and it's not really that shocking. Then again, I was reading Colette's Claudine, which was published 50, 60 years earlier, and that was way more shocking. So for me, this was just another brilliant but very French novel in that tradition.
So were you glad you read it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good for book club?
Yes, I don't know. It's very easy and it's very slight, and as I say, it's not shocking nowadays. But if you wanted a light breather, it could be good.
Well, I feel like we haven't really managed to come up with very many good book club recommendations.
Poverty Safari.
Poverty Safari, yeah.
Highly recommend Poverty Safari.
Yeah. Okay.
There we go.
Great.
That's actually good for me because I want everyone to read Poverty Safari and we haven't distracted them with other books.
Yeah, that's true. So that's what we've been reading, but now it's your turn. Laura Fellows from Islington in London wrote to tell me about her book club, which has 8 members and has been going for about 2.5 years. The standout favourite for me, she said, was Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. Half of us related to the cantankerous, short-fused wife mother, and the other half thought that she was monstrous, so that made for a good discussion and exposed some very differing views of marriage and parenthood. Have you read that one?
I haven't.
I have. I could see that it would be a good book club book, actually. Yeah, it's got great, strong characters who you're not sure if you like or not, and it's well written. Yeah. The most successful book club choice, she said, might have been Chekhov's short stories. The choosers selected 10 from a collection, and we felt a little daunted by the prospect, but found them, in fact, very accessible and immediate, often devastating. They were like parables, while at the same time showing a lot about the time in which he was writing. We found him intriguing and found it impossible to pin down his worldview. It was also interesting to discuss reading from translation. I bet that would be good. I have read Chekhov.
I can't remember if I've read any Chekhov.
I can't exactly. I'm like, well, what have I read? But I know I have, and I know when I have read him, I've thought, yes, this is amazing. So
I think it's quite ambitious to read a bit of Chekhov.
But I think that's why short stories would be good, wouldn't it? So book clubs out there who are thinking about getting into some Russian literature, that might be the way to go.
Easier than War and Peace.
I love War and Peace. Everyone should read War and Peace.
I haven't read War and Peace.
War and Peace is not a hard read. This is the thing people don't realise about War and Peace. It's such a page turner. It's like a soap opera. Laura, thank you so much for getting in touch. Listeners, if you've read something you think would make for a brilliant book club book, then drop us a line and let us know. We would love to hear about it. Write to us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
That's all for this episode. If you missed it, our latest book club show is on Normal People by Sally Rooney. This short novel set in post-financial collapse Ireland has won a raft of awards and been highly praised by critics. But did my book club find it worthy of the hype? Listen in to find out.
And also at the top of our podcast feed, you'll find our latest interview with historian Simon Sharma. Listen in to find out what he reads to go to sleep happy, why he's read War and Peace 9 times, and why he's never managed to write the novel he has all planned out. Plus a ton of brilliant book suggestions, including a book club recommendation specially for us.
Finally, if you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.